Letitia James walked into power with the kind of silence that makes men nervous. That was the line whispered by a junior aide as the elevator doors shut, sealing off the 14th floor of the New York Attorney General's office. What followed next wasn't a warm welcome, nor a nod to history. It was a stare, just one flat, unblinking from a white male staffer who held the door and didn't say a word. Not good morning, not congratulations, just that stare. And in offices like this, silence isn't just rudeness. It's a signal. Letitia was no stranger to that kind of quiet. She had walked through it in courtrooms, in council meetings, in debates that started with praise and ended with clenched jaws. But this one hit differently. The hallway polished, institutional, perfectly lit, felt like a stage already set, and every actor on it had rehearsed the same line. Ignore her. The new AG, the black woman who had dared to win, the woman they would smile for on press day, but quietly undermine every other morning. That morning's executive briefing was her first official meeting as the 67th Attorney General of New York. The conference room was full. The AC hummed. The coffee was cold. 3 people offered eye contact. 2 nodded. No one clapped. And then Derek Rivers spoke. He didn't even rise from his seat. Legs crossed, arms folded, tie slightly loosened like he'd already had a long day, even though it was 9:03 a.m. "This office," he said, dragging out the syllables like a man preparing for his own eulogy, "has had 74 years of institutional stability. I trust the rhythm won't be disrupted." It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't even a challenge. It was a leash tossed onto the floor, daring her to step into it. Letitia didn't bite. Ryan Holland went next, Director of Legal Operations, Princeton educated, press polished, face like granite, smile like bleach. He slid a file across the table. Budget review, outdated numbers. "We can amend as needed," he said, eyes not on the page, but on her. Though, of course, the final word belongs to the Attorney General. A pause, a smirk. Then he leaned back. The line was hollow, but the message underneath wasn't. "Well, watch you speak. We won't listen." Letitia gave a single nod. No retort, no raised brow, no lecture on governance or respect. She picked up the pen on the table, her pen, and clicked it once. Internally, the camera feed caught what the room missed, the subtle tightening of her grip. Pressure, not from fear, from control. And as Ryan turned his head to check the time, her eyes were locked not on him, but on the organizational map behind him. Color-coded, departmental, precise. It wasn't a chart. It was a battlefield, and she was memorizing every single flank. Because what none of them knew, what too many of them had forgotten, was that Letitia James didn't walk into this office to be liked. She came to be obeyed. And when a woman like that walks in without raising her voice, you'd be a fool to assume she doesn't know exactly where the knives are. The first 3 weeks weren't a mistake. They were choreography, a routine of petty sabotage executed with the discipline of a string quartet and the creativity of a kindergarten class. Letitia James, New York's Attorney General, wasn't being resisted with grand declarations or bold defiance. No, what she faced was far more pathetic and far more telling. Her 9 a.m. meetings were moved to 8:30 without notice. Her requests for files arrived incomplete, missing critical pages. Memos she never approved landed in inboxes with her name at the top, written in fonts she'd never use, authorizing initiatives she'd never endorse. The passive-aggressive warfare of bureaucrats in suits, and none of it clever enough to hide its true purpose. They weren't just pushing back against a new boss. They were auditioning for each other's approval, and nothing says we're not racist like collectively erasing the only black woman in the room, one clerical error at a time. Take, for instance, the office party, hosted by Derek River, advertised in the shadows, and attended by nearly every mid- and senior-level manager in the AG's office. No formal invitations, no calendar event. Just a clinking of glasses in a rooftop bar, coordinated entirely over their private group chat. Task Force Legacy, a name so comically colonial it might as well have been printed on a musket. Letitia saw it the next morning while scrolling through Instagram, where a junior staffer had posted a boomerang of Ryan Holland giving a toast. The caption? To keeping tradition alive. Tradition, in this case, meant exclusion. The humiliation didn't stop there. An email Letitia sent requesting budget access was mysteriously forwarded to a press contact at a liberal blog. By the time it reached the public, the text had been neatly trimmed and reassembled like a bad ransom note framing her inquiry as a desperate hunt for campaign slush funds. NYAG digs for secret donations, the headline blared. A lie built from fragments of truth, which, of course, made it stickier. Ryan denied leaking it. Derek rolled his eyes. The press team blamed a misclick, because apparently the IT department in the highest legal office in the state still operates like a college dorm LAN. In the hallways, the sabotage matured into mockery. Conversations would hush when she passed. Laughter would restart behind her back, a second too loud to be innocent. They didn't call her names. That would have required the spine to speak. Instead, they let their silence speak for them. Only one voice dared break ranks, a black intern, barely 24, who had sent a data brief praising Letitia's restructuring initiative. She was transferred to another department within days. No explanation, just an email thanking her for her rotation flexibility. Letitia noticed it all. She didn't confront. She recorded every misstep, every manipulated file, every name. They thought she was being passive, but she wasn't passive. She was collecting, and she was counting. The notebook appeared one Tuesday afternoon. Small black leather. No label. She placed it on her desk during a strategy call. Didn't open it. Just laid it flat like a deck of cards no one else could see. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder that while they whispered in corners, she was building a file in plain sight. This wasn't office politics. This was cowardice in a suit and tie. And the thing about cowardice is, it never knows when it's gone too far. Because once you've erased someone from the picture, you forget they're still in the room and watching. So, when the next accident happened, when the next leak didn't behave like a leak, Letitia would be ready. And this time, she wouldn't just write it down. She'd answer back. Not with anger, but with something far more effective. Exposure. Now the question wasn't whether they feared her. It was how long they thought they could pretend she wasn't watching. She hadn't seen the gun yet, but she could smell the powder. The air inside her office had changed. Too clean, too quiet. Like someone had wiped the scene after staging it. Letitia James didn't know the full plan yet, but what she did know was enough. Someone was trying to build a case that didn't exist, and they weren't subtle about it, which, in a way, made it worse. Because when someone this desperate starts rushing the con, it's not just malicious, it's sloppy. And sloppiness gets people hurt. Across town, in a wine bar so overpriced it served resentment with garnish, Derek River and Ryan Holland met under the guise of a strategic lunch. Strategic, in this case, meant one thing. They needed Letitia out. Not next year. Not next quarter. Now. She had started asking too many questions. Not just the right ones, dangerous ones. And with federal oversight tightening, the woman they thought would fold under silence had started circling back to things they had long buried. "If we wait too long," Derek muttered over a glass of Malbec he couldn't pronounce, "we won't just lose face. Well, lose funding." Translation: she was getting close to the money. Enter their ace, an old associate of the office. Technically a person of interest in 3 different cases. Unofficially, a broker of favors with a long memory and longer grudge. He'd once run logistics for a pharmaceutical distribution network turned fentanyl trafficking ring, hiding liquid doses in fake medical bags. Derek knew this because he had helped redact parts of that report 5 years ago. Now, with a few encrypted messages and the promise of immunity somewhere down the line, the man returned with an offer: a vehicle swap. Letitia's office SUV, her standard issue, black Chevrolet Tahoe, would be taken in for routine servicing under the agency fleet schedule. In reality, it would be replaced with an identical model, rigged with a custom-built fentanyl compartment hidden behind the driver's seat, undetectable to the eye. But dogs would go wild. One traffic stop, one press leak, and suddenly, the first black woman AG of New York becomes AG caught in drug probe. A scandal served cold with body cam footage and commentary from anonymous sources. Meanwhile, Ryan handled the paperwork. Because every smear campaign needs a paper trail that feels believable. He crafted a fabricated tax report showing Letitia had underreported earnings from campaign events and speaking fees both legally exempt but conveniently ambiguous. Then he forged a memo with her signature, conveniently dated to overlap with a real stack of budget documents she had signed during a marathon week of meetings. Nothing screams guilt like too many signatures on too many pages. The coup de GRCE, a surprise internal audit from the agency's narcotics compliance unit. Derek scheduled it under the pretense of federal harmonization. The date? 2 days after the SUV switch. 1 day before Ryan planned to accidentally forward the fake tax docs to a financial watchdog journalist always hungry for a scoop. It was perfect, in that dystopian house of cards for mid-level managers kind of way. Back in her office, Letitia felt it all closing in, not through evidence, but through atmosphere. The shift in tone, the sudden respect. Too many Mom-s. Too many people returning calls too fast. It's the paradox of politics. The moment you're being hunted, everyone suddenly starts smiling at you. She didn't have proof. Yet. But she'd been around enough trials to know the difference between suspicion and scent. And the room reeked. She began rechecking documents twice, watching which aides lingered. Who asked what? Who stopped asking? She didn't run. She waited. Because whatever they were planning, it required her to walk blindly into it. But Letitia James had made a career of seeing what others pretend not to, and this time someone else was about to trip the wire they built. Because while Derek and Ryan rehearsed their takedown in wine bars and burner phones, they forgot one critical detail. It only takes one misstep to turn a setup into a confession. And somewhere behind that blackout SUV and fake tax form, Letitia was already loading her own weapon, not with bullets, but names. Names that would soon be written in ink, under oath. There's a particular silence that precedes betrayal, not the silence of ignorance, but the kind that comes from people who know too much, too early, and hope you don't notice their timing. Letitia noticed. She noticed when her SUV was scheduled for technical inspection twice in 10 days without any request from her, no incident reported, and no paperwork filed. The first time she let it go. The second time she started writing names. There was no formal complaint. Just a quiet conversation with Wallace, the driver who'd worked with her since the DA's office. The kind of man who calls every engine a she and treats seat belts like lifelines. Every time they take her in, she said, write down the plate and look for scratches. Wallace didn't flinch. By the third visit, he came back with a note. Same model, same smell. But there's a scratch, passenger side rear. A clean one. Not from wear, fresh. That was all she needed to hear, because her Tahoe had been in near mint condition since delivery. No scratches, no changeouts, nothing that justified a last-minute switch. The official log said it was routine fleet maintenance, but Letitia didn't believe in coincidences, especially not from men who misplace files with the efficiency of Swiss clocks. A few days later, an old acquaintance came calling. Not on purpose. He just happened to be the technician assigned to her vehicle that week, a gruff, soft-spoken garage worker who once testified in a case she prosecuted years ago. She remembered his boots. He remembered her cross-examination. Now, after everyone else left the garage, he pulled her aside. "Mom, they had some out-of-office boys looking at your floor vents. Said it was about emissions compliance. But emissions don't come from under the seat." That was how he said it. No drama, just data. The kind that made your gut tighten and your hands stay still. The next morning, the avalanche came. In a sealed packet marked Quarterly Review, she found her budget summary, a routine update, except this one included a set of tax documents attached as if they belonged. On page 3, her signature, neat, accurate, and entirely forged, endorsing a reimbursement she never filed, on a date she remembered clearly because it was the same day she was trapped in a 6-hour budget hearing without breaks. The signature wasn't the problem. The precision was. It mimicked her pen pressure, her phrasing. Whoever did this had studied her like a case file. That's when she understood. This wasn't sabotage. This was war. They weren't trying to stall her. They were trying to bury her. Drugs and tax fraud. The two things no prosecutor survives. One puts you behind bars. The other ensures you're forgotten there. It was no longer about office politics. It was about making her radioactive, unfundable, unemployable, finished. But Letitia James was raised in the Bronx, not bred in boardrooms. She didn't cry foul. She didn't send an email. She sent an invitation, a coffee meeting. Not in Manhattan, not in Albany. In the Bronx, where stories are told in corners and power doesn't wear a suit. She chose a cafe across from the courthouse where she'd once tried her first felony case. The barista still remembered her drink. The recipient of the invitation? Amy. Pale-skinned, soft-voiced, and perpetually overlooked. A white assistant with an Ivy League degree and a resume longer than most rap sheets, but always, somehow, left out of the inner circle. Amy had once worked under Ryan, but she never laughed at his jokes, never stayed late for the drinks meetings, and she never looked at Letitia the way the others did. She just watched, quietly, precisely. Letitia stirred her coffee once, twice, then said, "I'm not asking what you know. I'm asking if you're ready to start counting." Amy didn't smile. She just leaned forward and said, "I've been counting since the second week." And just like that, the counterattack began, not with press conferences or public outrage, but with two women in a Bronx cafe, trading silence for strategy, ready to turn a setup into exposure, one paperclip at a time. Amy didn't say yes. Not at the cafe, not in the cab ride home. Not the next day when she passed Letitia in the hallway and nodded like nothing had happened. But 48 hours later, without warning, a zipped file arrived in Letitia's encrypted inbox. No subject line, No explanation, just a digital Trojan horse labeled Schedule D. Inside, the silent war became a broadcast. Dozens of email threads between Ryan and Derek surfaced messages laced with corporate euphemisms so thinly veiled they might as well have been written in crayon. One read, "Confirm install after Friday. Shelby out by noon. Floor team to proceed under tag ventilation audit." Another, "Needs someone to lose the 10/999 schedule in her tax folder. Use the version from March 12th. It's already got her signature. But the smoking gun was an audio file low quality, badly mic'd, but unmistakably Ryan's voice, nasal and smug like a hedge fund villain in a D-list Netflix thriller. "We're pulling the fentanyl and the tax lever at the same time," he bragged to an unidentified co-conspirator. "It's a 2-act performance. Premieres in 2 weeks. Might even get us a standing ovation, or at least a resignation." There was laughter, ugly, too loud, the kind of laugh that only comes from men who think the system works for them because, well, it always has. Letitia didn't forward the file to any agency. She didn't tweet. She didn't threaten. She copied it onto a single encrypted flash drive and handed it, in person, to a former DOJ investigator now working in counter-corruption, a man who once stood beside her during the Weinstein grand jury hearings. His name never appeared in the press. That's how she knew he was still useful. Meanwhile, Amy became a ghost in plain sight. She resumed her role as silent assistant carrying files, fetching coffee, preparing notes for meetings she knew were wired with deception. Ryan called her dependable. Derek complimented her discretion. Neither noticed when she slipped her phone into record mode during their budget prep sessions. Neither questioned why she always asked them to restate the action items at the end of every meeting. "Just so I don't miss anything," she'd smile. Derek, who once joked that she'd make a great housewife, told her she had a future in management. To keep up appearances, Letitia staged a decoy. She accepted an invitation to speak at the National Justice Leadership Summit in Denver, 3 days of panel discussions, keynote addresses, and strategic meetings with state prosecutors. She left the office in a tailored gray suit and a press release that read, "The Attorney General continues her work for equitable reform across state lines." But her real agenda was simpler. Give the boys just enough rope. Because with Letitia gone, Derek and Ryan saw a window. The vehicle inspection was rescheduled for Friday, precisely while she would be on stage discussing racial disparities in federal sentencing. Internal buzz said a compliance team would access her SUV that afternoon. They believed they'd get in, plant the evidence, and walk away with a timed leak to the press by Monday. Clean, professional, untouchable. But what neither of them knew was that Wallace had installed a dash cam unbeknownst to any office protocol, and the footage streamed directly to a private server. Nor did they know that the person assigned to log the inspection report that day was not their usual fixer, but a temp from the federal pool, hand-picked by Letitia's contact. And they definitely didn't know that Amy had looped in a digital forensics analyst from her grad school days to scrub metadata on the forged tax file. This wasn't just defense. It was a rehearsal for indictment. Letitia wasn't buying time. She was building the narrative, brick by digital brick, and waiting for the moment when the villains would recite their lines on tape, under oath, and in full public view. The moment Letitia James boarded her train to D.C., the vultures back in Albany descended. Derek River wasted no time. With a grin so smug it could curdle milk, he fired off a memo titled Operational Integrity Check Vehicle Division. The pretext? A citywide alert on fentanyl contamination and the office's duty to lead by example. the actual objective? Catch the Attorney General's SUV red-handed, with a bag of synthetic doom tucked neatly behind the driver's seat. A car that had, unbeknownst to her, been swapped and rigged twice. That memo traveled through the chain of command faster than common sense could stop it. Hours later, Letitia's assigned SUV, technically a state vehicle, was randomly pulled into a Department of Administrative garage, dogs brought in, and surprise, a tightly sealed pouch of white powder was found hidden beneath the ventilation panel. The canines barked on cue. A prepared inspection report was conveniently drafted in record time, and by 4:17 p.m., a local blog no one reads until they suddenly broke the story with an all-caps headline: "Fentanyl found in NYAGS, car internal source claims investigation underway." Cue the feeding frenzy. By 6 p.m., cable news was wheeling out talking heads speculating about drug networks, cartel ties, and whether the Attorney General of New York might soon be sitting next to the very people she once indicted. But while Derek and Ryan were busy congratulating each other in their echo chamber of smug mediocrity, they missed one critical variable. Letitia had built the board, and she was the one moving the pieces. At that very moment, she was standing behind a podium at the National Conference on Justice Reform, addressing an audience of prosecutors and judges with the same clarity and calm she'd weaponized in courtrooms for 2 decades. No stammer, no retreat. Her opening line? Justice doesn't flinch just because the headlines scream. Meanwhile, back in New York, Ryan Holland, emboldened by the unfolding spectacle, decided it was time to light the second fuse. He prepared to leak the falsified tax documents, the same ones Letitia had never signed, but that bore her forged signature in bold black ink. He had the journalist on speed dial, the talking points pre-written, and the angle ready: public funds, improper deductions, abuse of office. But before he could hit send, the New York Times dropped a digital bomb. Headline: "Internal plot to frame Ag Letitia James exposed." And the subhead was worse: "Leaked emails, altered vehicle records, and a smoking gun audio tape." The piece laid it all out: emails between Derek and Ryan referencing Schedule D, the vehicle shop logs showing unauthorized modification requests, and, of course, the recording of Ryan bragging, "We're pulling the fentanyl and tax trigger at once. Should go live in 2 weeks." It was no longer an office prank gone rogue. It was a coordinated political assassination attempt, and the public had receipts. Amy, the quiet assistant they barely noticed, had turned the whole narrative on its head. Her anonymous tip to the Times included metadata, timestamps, and cross-referenced memos. No speculation, no smoke, just fire. By sunrise, federal agents were at Derek's brownstone and Ryan's country club parking spot with subpoenas in hand. No one cried. No one protested. Because when the chessboard flips, pawns don't get a press conference. And Letitia? She was already in a car back to New York, sipping black coffee, reading the Times article with a faint smile. She didn't need revenge. She needed exposure. The room was supposed to be under control. Derek and Ryan had scheduled the emergency meeting to regain command of the narrative, though calling it a fentanyl crisis meeting was like trying to mop up a flood with a cocktail napkin. They entered with the posture of men who still believed their ties held more authority than subpoenas, barking orders at the press team, snapping at junior counsels, deleting emails in real time while pretending to clarify messaging. Ryan, always a fan of dramatics, stood in front of the projector like a rejected Netflix villain and announced, "We must lock down all internal communications. Any comment about the AG's vehicle incident will come through us," as if silence could rewind a federal investigation. Derek followed up, chest puffed like a deflated rooster, insisting they protect the institutional image of the office from what he called external noise. Their arrogance wasn't just tone-deaf, it was symphonic in its delusion. The rest of the room sat frozen, pretending not to have read the front-page New York Times article that morning. A detailed expose featuring screenshots, audio, timestamps, and the kind of journalistic killshot that made coffee taste different. The headline read like a gravestone: "How Two Men Built a Lie and Got Buried by the Truth." Then the knockless entrance. 1 federal agent, 1 clipboard, 2 warrants, no introduction, no pleasantries. Derek River, Ryan Holland. You're both under federal summons for conspiracy to falsify evidence and tamper with public records. Panic isn't always loud. Sometimes it sounds like silence, held just a second too long. Derek blinked, mouth twitching, still performing his mental gymnastics, trying to pivot from bureaucrat to victim. "This is a mistake," he muttered. "There's no basis for the agent didn't flinch. Save it for the hearing." Ryan wasn't so composed. "This is political. It's a smear job," he shouted, sweat breaking through his collar. "We were following protocol." Another agent, younger, flipped through the transcript and replied without looking up. "You called it a performance in your own words. Too bad you didn't rehearse the ending." Letitia James entered as if scripted by the gods of poetic justice, calm, precise, utterly immune to the chaos around her. She didn't gloat, didn't raise her voice. Instead, she addressed the room the way a surgeon addresses a tumor, clinically. "I'm not here to accuse anyone," she said. "We have evidence. We follow that. The rest is noise." No one clapped. No one needed to. The message was louder than any applause. The reign of backdoor deals and thinly veiled sabotage was over. The same staff who had ignored her now stared at the floor like students caught cheating in an ethics class. Some of them quietly clicked off their phones, realizing too late that silence, once used as a weapon, now tasted like shame. One assistant, visibly shaken, whispered to another. She warned them without ever saying a word. Letitia turned toward the exit, pausing only to glance at Derek as he was cuffed. There was no malice, no satisfaction, only the cold clarity of someone who'd kept the receipts. And just before leaving, she dropped the line that cracked the room open like glass under pressure. "You thought the story was yours. Turns out you were just a footnote. But stories rarely end with arrests. They end when systems break, when masks fall, and when power is redistributed in uncomfortable silence." And Letitia wasn't done writing. She was just getting to the footnotes. The nation didn't blink, it exploded. By noon, every cable news channel had carved a chunk of its broadcast schedule to dissect the downfall. MSNBC painted it as a systemic implosion of white-collar rot. Fox ran the chyron, elite frame job. AG targeted with fentanyl trap. CNN, doing its usual dance of cautious phrasing, opened with fentanyl, fraud, and a fractured office. What's next for the NYAG? It didn't matter who you tuned in to. Derek River and Ryan Holland had gone from office power brokers to cautionary memes within hours. Their LinkedIn profiles were already being archived as exhibits A and B of what institutional arrogance looks like when cornered by competence. But the real headline wasn't about the fall. It was about the reckoning. The New York Attorney General's office announced an independent review spanning 7 years of internal reporting and procedural manipulation. Not by Letitia's internal aides, by an external team hand-picked, firewalled, immune to old loyalties. She wasn't just cleaning house. She was raising the floorboards, brick by brick. Letitia's first press conference since the scandal made no attempt at sentimentality. No dramatic hand gestures, no rehearsed outrage, just a sentence so blunt it sliced through every microphone in the room. When a system collapses from within, you don't fix it with apologies, you fix it with legitimacy. That line ricocheted through social media like a missile coated in moral authority. Across the AG's press room, the usual crowd of politicos, analysts, and opportunists froze mid-note, because what she just said wasn't a soundbite material. It was a verdict. Meanwhile, formal indictments were unsealed. Both Derek and Ryan were charged with conspiracy to defame a public official, collusion with a fentanyl trafficking intermediary, fabrication of federal documents, and institutional sabotage. The legal phrasing was dry. The implications weren't. These weren't just two rogue bureaucrats, they were architects of a coup by paperwork. And now the scaffolding was collapsing. But Letitia didn't stop at the figureheads. Several staffers, those who had chosen complicity by silence, were placed on immediate suspension pending investigation. No press release softened the blow. No HR jargon diluted the fact. Turning away from a crime is a form of contribution. That phrase, reportedly written by Letitia herself in the internal memo, was now being quoted by law professors and tattooed onto political Twitter headers alike. Yet, amid all the smoke, one figure remained curiously off-stage. Amy. The assistant who'd fed the thread that unraveled a network of deceit, had refused every interview, dodged every network offer, and left her name echoing without a face. Letitia, when asked once about her role, said only, "Some people aren't meant to be known, so history can record them properly. No grandeur, no exposition. Just the kind of restraint that made cable pundits squirm. Because in a world obsessed with credit, here stood a story built on integrity so quiet, it silenced a city. But justice doesn't sleep after indictments, it circles." And as Derek and Ryan prepared for arraignment, whispers began to stir about who else knew, who else signed, who else stayed silent, not out of fear, but because they thought Letitia would never last long enough to matter. They were wrong, and she was about to prove just how wrong they really were. The courtroom was sterile, but the confessions cut like acid. Derek River and Ryan Holland stood before the federal bench, their suits no longer symbols of command but of resignation. Both pleaded guilty at the preliminary hearing, a move so swift it stunned even their own attorneys. Ryan, in a final attempt at damage control, declared, "I was only following Derek's lead." But forensic audits and email chains laid bare a more cynical truth. It was Ryan who first charted the blueprint, who named the operation Schedule D, who chuckled about pulling the fentanyl and tax strings at once. Derek was the accomplice. Yes, but Ryan was the playwright. And the script, riddled with criminal arrogance, had finally reached its closing act. The judge, unmoved by their mea culpas or polished legalese, denied bail. The two would await full trial behind bars. Federal guidelines suggested sentences of up to 25 years thanks to the Category 1 narcotics involved and the use of public office to orchestrate the frame-up. It was no longer a scandal. It was institutional treason. But the reckoning wasn't confined to the courtroom. For the first time in the history of the New York Attorney General's office, a confidence vote was triggered, an unprecedented signal that the institution itself had reached a breaking point and needed reaffirmation. The result? 91% voted to reaffirm Letitia James as Attorney General. Not because of charisma, not because of politics, but because against every expectation, she had stood alone and won. She had walked through a storm of collusion, silence, and orchestrated downfall and returned not only intact but in control. The governor, breaking with his usual lawyered-up blandness, issued a public statement that caught national attention. Letitia James has not only upheld the law, she has defended the very definition of justice from those who had defiled it from within. For a brief moment, clarity pierced through the noise. Emails followed, dozens of them, from staffers, deputies, consultants, and former friends. The ones who had looked away, whispered doubts, or excused themselves from conflict during the chaos. Apologies poured in, some sincere, others strategic. Most were ignored. Letitia granted only a small fraction the chance to re-enter her circle, and even then, never without scrutiny. Redemption in her office was not a press release. It was a reconstruction. Brick by brick, loyalty had to be proven, not claimed. At a closed-door internal meeting days later, she didn't make a speech. She didn't celebrate. She didn't demand applause. Instead, she said one line, quiet, heavy, and final. If you think this ends when the verdict is read, then you still don't understand real justice begins where people stop turning away. That sentence didn't trend. It wasn't turned into merch. But those in the room felt its weight like a nail to the chest, because for the first time, the office didn't just have a leader, it had a standard, and anyone who couldn't meet it would be excused, politely or not. Outside, the press shifted toward new spectacles, but inside the AG's office, an entirely different storm was just beginning. The one that asks, what happens when justice finally wakes up and decides to remember every name that helped put it to sleep? Letitia James didn't just survive a mutiny, she dismantled the entire command chain that allowed it to fester. Within weeks, she fired nearly 40% of the office's middle management. A purge executed not out of vengeance, but necessity. The message was unmistakable loyalty to process, not politics. In place of the old guard, she introduced a sweeping 3-tier reform plan. Elevate young attorneys from minority communities, enforce independent oversight across all prosecutorial units, and require full transparency in the handling of internal complaints. It wasn't a makeover. It was a structural reckoning. No more veils, no more backroom nods, no more conspiratorial shrugs dressed up as professional discretion. But if there was one appointment that turned heads from Harlem to Capitol Hill, it was Imus. The once muted assistant, who had spent years walking the knife's edge of power proximity, was now officially named Director of Internal Oversight. A Latina in a position traditionally reserved for white male loyalists, her ascension wasn't just administrative. It was a declaration of war against institutional complicity. Headlines swarmed. From shadow to spotlight, whistleblower appointed to lead AG reforms. MSNBC called it a shot across the bow of bureaucratic silence. Fox News naturally muttered about DEI overreach. But Letitia didn't care. Her strategy had never been to please, it was to expose, rebuild, and lead. At Columbia Law, standing before rows of fresh-eyed students and a few professors who once doubted her some, she delivered a speech that wasn't a victory lap. It was a call to arms. I used to walk into rooms like this, she said, and see every pair of eyes land on me like I didn't belong. Today, I stand here not to punish those glances, but to make sure no one else has to walk alone like I did. No dramatics, no self-congratulation, just a truth sharpened by battle. The room, filled with future litigators, fell into a silence deeper than any applause could reach, because they understood. She wasn't just rewriting the culture of the AG's office, she was reprogramming the muscle memory of American justice. The story doesn't end on a podium. It ends on the cold sidewalk outside her office, long past midnight. No security detail, no press trailing her heels. Just the wind cutting down from the Hudson and the faint clang of a church bell in the Bronx. Letitia walked with her coat collar turned up, a single folder in hand. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Power, for her, no longer meant being protected. It meant choosing to be alone when it would have been easier to be surrounded. In a city where ambition is loud, her silence screamed legacy. Because some women don't bow, some don't blink, and some, like Letitia James, walk forward even when the whole system once hoped they wouldn't.